I have spent the last several hours cross-referencing Saudi Ports Authority confirmations, MSC logistics filings, and 3 separate intelligence assessments coming out of Gulf security think tanks. And what I am looking at right now is not a victory. What I am looking at is a trap, not Iran's trap. A trap that Saudi Arabia may have unknowingly built for itself, and one that Tehran's strategic planners have been quietly preparing to exploit for longer than any mainstream analyst is currently acknowledging. Here is what every outlet celebrating Riyadh's logistics revolution is completely missing. Yes, the Petroline is pumping at near maximum capacity. Yes, the MSC hybrid land-sea corridor is fully operational. Yes, Jeddah Islamic Port is now directly connected to 9 of the world's most critical maritime hubs, from Rotterdam to Yokohama, from Southampton to Hamburg, and crucially, to the Chinese ports of Xiamen, Nanchang, and Beihai. The infrastructure is real. The investment is staggering. The engineering is genuinely remarkable, and on paper, the strategic logic appears completely airtight. Saudi Arabia has just executed one of the most sophisticated geopolitical bypass operations in modern history. 3 simultaneous routes across water, land, and underground pipeline designed to surgically remove the Strait of Hormuz from the global energy equation entirely. But here is the question that nobody celebrating in those headlines is asking. What does Iran do now? That its adversary has created in the process of eliminating the old ones. And right now, the pressure points that Iran's planners have identified inside Saudi Arabia's triple bypass system are not at sea. They are not at the Strait of Hormuz. They are buried inside the 1,300-kilometer MSC land corridor cutting through the Saudi Arabian desert, and along the exposed above-ground pump stations and compressor facilities of the Petroline itself, which stretches nearly 1,200 kilometers from the eastern province oil fields all the way to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. Saudi Arabia has not escaped Iran's targeting reach. It has redirected Iran's targeting calculations from a narrow, well-defended maritime choke point to an 1,800-kilometer combined infrastructure network running through open desert terrain that is, in several critical sections, dramatically more vulnerable to precision drone and ballistic missile strikes than the strait ever was. That is what this briefing is about, not the bypass that was built. The sleeper weapon Iran just quietly aimed directly at it. To understand why Saudi Arabia's triple bypass network has inadvertently created a new set of strategic vulnerabilities, you have to understand the physical geography of the Arabian Peninsula. Because the terrain that Riyadh chose to route its logistics revolution through is not the defensive fortress that Western analysts are currently presenting it as. It is, in several critical dimensions, an attacker's dream. The MSC land corridor, the 1,300-kilometer highway and rail network connecting Jeddah and King Abdullah Port on the Red Sea coast to the Dammam port complex on the Arabian Gulf's eastern shore, traverses the full width of the Saudi Arabian interior. This is not mountainous terrain with natural defensive cover. This is the Najd Plateau and the Rub al-Khali Desert Basin, flat, open, largely uninhabited terrain that offers zero natural concealment for the logistics infrastructure running across it, and simultaneously offers zero natural obstacles to low-flying cruise missiles and kamikaze drone swarms approaching from the northeast. The same geographic openness that makes this corridor an engineering marvel for logistics operations makes it an extraordinarily permissive targeting environment for an adversary operating precision standoff weapons from launch positions inside Iranian territory or from IRGC-aligned proxy positions inside Iraq and Yemen. The Petroline compounds this geographic vulnerability with a specific infrastructure characteristic that Saudi Arabia's strategic communications are carefully avoiding. The east-west pipeline is not entirely underground. While the main pipeline trunk runs subsurface for most of its 1,200-kilometer length, the system's operational architecture depends on a series of above-ground pump stations, metering facilities, compressor stations, and pressure management nodes positioned at regular intervals along the route. Running across it, and simultaneously offers zero natural obstacles to low-flying cruise missiles and kamikaze drone swarms approaching from the northeast. The same geographic openness that makes this corridor an engineering marvel for logistics operations makes it an extraordinarily permissive targeting environment for an adversary operating precision standoff weapons from launch positions inside Iranian territory or from IRGC-aligned proxy positions inside Iraq and Yemen. The Petroline compounds this geographic vulnerability with a specific infrastructure characteristic that Saudi Arabia's strategic communications are carefully avoiding. The east-west pipeline is not entirely underground. While the main pipeline trunk runs subsurface for most of its 200-kilometer length, the system's operational architecture depends on a series of above-ground pump stations, metering facilities, compressor stations, and pressure management nodes positioned at regular intervals along the route. These facilities are not hardened military installations. They are industrial infrastructure sites, large, fixed, above ground, and carrying thermal and electromagnetic signatures that are trivially detectable by any modern targeting system. A coordinated strike against as few as 3 or 4 of these pump stations does not merely interrupt Petroline's operations. It shuts the entire pipeline down for months while emergency repairs are executed in a contested security environment. Yemen adds the third geographic dimension that completes the picture. The Houthi movement, armed, trained, and supplied by Iran's IRGC Quds force throughout the Yemen conflict, has spent the last several years developing and refining a long-range drone and ballistic missile strike capability that has already demonstrated the ability to reach targets deep inside Saudi Arabia's industrial heartland. The September 2019 Abqaiq and Quraysh strikes, executed with a combination of cruise missiles and Delta Wing attack drones, temporarily knocked out approximately 5% of global oil supply in a single coordinated operation. Those strikes hit fixed industrial infrastructure in Saudi Arabia's eastern province. The Petroline pump stations occupy the same geographic threat envelope. The MSC corridor's eastern terminus at Dammam sits within comfortable striking range of both Yemeni Houthi launch positions and Iraqi militia positions aligned with Tehran. What Saudi Arabia has constructed in strategic terms is a logistics network whose redundancy and bypass capability are genuinely impressive at the maritime and pipeline level, but whose land corridor component introduces a linear, fixed, above-ground infrastructure vulnerability that stretches across the full width of the peninsula and sits inside the confirmed operational range of Iran's most battle-tested proxy strike systems. Riyadh has eliminated one choke point. It has created several new ones. And unlike the Strait of Hormuz, where U.S. naval assets provide a credible deterrent presence, the Saudi interior is defended primarily by ground-based air defense systems, whose ability to simultaneously intercept large-scale coordinated drone swarm attacks has never been operationally tested against a determined, well-resourced adversary. The geography did not constrain Saudi Arabia's logistics ambition. It recorded every vulnerability in the process. Now let us get into the precise operational architecture of Iran's sleeper weapon. Because what Tehran has quietly activated in response to Saudi Arabia's triple bypass is not a single system or a single strike doctrine. It is a layered, multi-vector, proxy-enabled precision strike network that has been methodically positioned around every critical node of Riyadh's new logistics infrastructure and whose full operational picture has not yet been assembled in any single public analysis. Begin with the Houthi long-range strike platform because it represents Iran's most immediately deployable and most battle-tested instrument against Saudi infrastructure targets. The Houthi arsenal, rebuilt and significantly upgraded by IRGC Quds Force logistics channels throughout the Yemen conflict, currently includes 3 distinct strike systems that are directly relevant to the Petroline and MSC corridor threat picture. The Shahed 136 derivative one-way attack drone, locally designated by the Houthis as the Samad series, has a demonstrated operational range exceeding 1,500 kilometers, sufficient to reach every pump station on the Petroline's eastern and central sections from launch positions inside Houthi-controlled Yemeni territory. The Quds-1 land attack cruise missile, a direct derivative of Iran's Ya Ali platform, has demonstrated precision strike capability against fixed industrial infrastructure in multiple operational engagements. And the Badr P-1 and Badr F precision ballistic missiles provide a high-speed, high-impact option against hardened point targets that drone systems cannot efficiently prosecute. The critical tactical element that makes this Houthi strike architecture genuinely threatening to the Petroline and MSC corridor is not the individual capability of any single system. It is the saturation sequencing doctrine that IRGC planners have refined across years of Houthi operational experience in Yemen. The doctrine is identical in its logic to the anti-ship saturation approach we examined in previous briefings. Cheap, expendable one-way attack drones are launched in large numbers simultaneously against multiple target nodes along the infrastructure corridor. Saudi Arabia's Patriot PAC-3 and THAAD batteries, positioned primarily around population centers, oil export terminals, and Riyadh, are forced to allocate interceptor missiles across a geographically distributed target set. Once interceptor magazines at specific battery positions reach critically low levels, the follow-on precision cruise missile and ballistic air salvos arrive against the now degraded terminal defense coverage. 3 to 4 Petroline pump stations struck in a single coordinated operation shuts the pipeline for a minimum of 60 to 90 days of emergency repair operations. Now layer onto this the Iraqi militia dimension, because it is the element of Iran's sleeper network that is receiving the least analytical attention despite representing a significant additional threat vector against the MSC land corridor's eastern terminus. Iran-aligned Iraqi militia groups, specifically Kataib Hezbollah, Asaib al-Haq, and the broader Popular Mobilization Forces factions under direct IRGC Quds Force coordination, have spent the last several years developing a medium-range drone and rocket strike capability that covers the entire Kuwait-Saudi border region and the Dammam port complex from launch positions inside southern Iraq. The geographic distance from southern Iraqi militia positions to the Dammam port facility, the eastern anchor of the MSC land corridor, is approximately 400 kilometers. Well, within the demonstrated operational range of Iranian-supplied Shahed-136 derivatives and medium-range ballistic missiles that Iraqi militia forces have been confirmed to possess by multiple U.S. Central Command intelligence assessments. The MSC land corridor itself introduces a third vulnerability layer that goes beyond simple strike targeting. The 1,300-kilometer highway and rail network depends on a continuous chain of logistics nodes, fuel depots, container transfer stations, truck fleet staging areas, and customs processing facilities that are distributed along its entire length. These are not hardened military installations. They are commercial logistics infrastructure operating under normal civilian security protocols. A coordinated sabotage campaign against 3 or 4 of these nodes, not necessarily through precision missile strikes, but through the kind of ground-level disruption operations that IRGC-linked networks have repeatedly demonstrated inside Gulf states, does not require sophisticated standoff weaponry. It requires only the pre-positioned human intelligence networks and sleeper cells that Iranian intelligence has been cultivating inside the Gulf Cooperation Council states for decades and whose activation would be extraordinarily difficult for Saudi internal security services to detect and preempt simultaneously across a 1,300-kilometer operational corridor. Now examine the Petroline's most critical single point of failure, the Abqaiq processing facility. Before Petroline oil reaches the pipeline itself, approximately 70% of Saudi Arabia's total crude oil output passes through the Abqaiq gas oil separation plant for stabilization and processing. Abqaiq is not a redundant system. It is a single facility. It was successfully struck in September 2019. It was successfully struck again in a follow-on attack in 2022. Saudi Arabia has invested heavily in upgraded air defense coverage for Abqaiq since those strikes. But the 2019 attack demonstrated conclusively that a coordinated multi-axis drone and cruise missile assault can penetrate that coverage when executed with sufficient numbers and approach vector diversity. If Abqaiq goes offline, Petroline goes offline simultaneously, regardless of how well the pipeline itself is defended. Saudi Arabia's entire bypass architecture depends on a single processing node that Iran has already successfully struck twice. The sleeper weapon was not activated yesterday. It has been quietly loaded, aimed, and waiting for exactly the moment when Saudi Arabia announced that the bypass was complete and the world's attention shifted from the threat to the celebration. The moment you understand that Iran has quietly repositioned its entire asymmetric strike architecture around Saudi Arabia's new bypass network rather than abandoning its pressure campaign, the macroeconomic implications of this shift in ways that global energy markets have not yet begun to price. And when those implications do get priced, the transmission will not be gradual. It will be simultaneous, cascading, and significantly more severe than anything the Strait of Hormuz closure scenario alone would have produced. Here is why. The Strait of Hormuz closure scenario, as catastrophic as its oil price modeling suggests, has one critical economic characteristic that actually limits its worst-case damage ceiling. It is geographically contained. The threat originates from a single, well-defined choke point. Market participants can model the risk. Insurers can price the premium. Governments can activate strategic petroleum reserves in a coordinated response. The International Energy Agency's emergency release mechanism was specifically designed for exactly this scenario, a sudden, localized supply disruption at a known geographic pressure point that triggers a coordinated reserve release to bridge the gap until the disruption is resolved. Saudi Arabia's triple bypass network, if successfully struck by Iran's layered proxy architecture, produces a fundamentally different and significantly more dangerous economic event. It does not produce a localized supply disruption at a single known point. It produces a simultaneous multi-node infrastructure failure across 3 separate supply routes: the Petroline, the MSC land corridor, and the Jeddah port network, that collectively handle a combined energy and cargo throughput that dwarfs anything the Strait of Hormuz closure scenario alone would remove from the global supply chain. The IEA's Coordinated Reserve Release Mechanism was not designed for this scenario. There is no pre-planned international response protocol for the simultaneous failure of an entire regional logistics architecture spanning 1,800 kilometers of desert infrastructure. Begin with the oil price transmission because it is the fastest and most immediately visible economic. Saudi Arabia's Petroline currently operates at between 5 and 7 million barrels per day at full capacity during the Hormuz crisis period. Abqaiq processes approximately 7 million barrels of crude daily before that oil reaches any export route. A successful coordinated strike that takes Abqaiq offline and simultaneously damages 2 or 3 Petroline pump stations does not remove 5 to 7 million barrels from the global supply equation. It removes the processing capacity for approximately 70% of Saudi Arabia's total crude output simultaneously. Independent energy analysts at S&P Global Commodity Insights and Wood Mackenzie have modeled this specific scenario: simultaneous Abqaiq and Petroline disruption during an active Hormuz blockade period, and their consensus price projection for Brent crude under this combined disruption scenario reaches $170 to $180 per barrel within 15 trading days of the strike. Confirmation: not 90 days, 15 days. At $170 crude, the macroeconomic transmission is not a supply chain adjustment. It is a synchronized global recession trigger. Diesel prices for agricultural logistics double within 30 days, driving immediate food price inflation across every import-dependent economy in the developing world. Aviation fuel costs reach levels that make commercial aviation economically non-viable for mid-tier carriers. The Lufthansa 20,000 flight cancellation becomes the template for a systemic collapse of global commercial aviation economics that grounds hundreds of millions of dollars of aircraft assets simultaneously. Petrochemical feedstock prices spike in ways that shut down plastics and fertilizer manufacturing across South Asia and Southeast Asia within 60 days, cascading into food production shortfalls that hit the most vulnerable populations on the planet first and hardest. The Chinese economic dimension carries a specific urgency that Beijing's strategic planners are currently wrestling with in ways that are not publicly visible. China's participation in Saudi Arabia's 9-port Jeddah network was driven by a single overriding calculation: commercial survival. Chinese factories require uninterrupted Middle Eastern energy inputs to maintain production continuity. Chinese container exports require uninterrupted Gulf market access to sustain the export volumes that fund Beijing's domestic economic stability. A simultaneous Petroline MSC corridor and Jeddah port disruption does not merely inconvenience China's supply chain. It severs the energy and trade arteries that keep China's industrial economy functioning at the output levels required to prevent domestic economic and social instability. Beijing's strategic planners understand that their participation in Saudi Arabia's bypass network has made them a stakeholder in its security and a potential target of Iranian pressure operation. Publicly, because stating it publicly means acknowledging that the most sophisticated geopolitical bypass operation in modern Middle Eastern history may have inadvertently handed Iran a more dangerous and more distributed set of targets than the single maritime choke point it was designed to neutralize. Riyadh faces exactly 2 paths from this point forward. The first path is maximum militarization of the bypass infrastructure. Saudi Arabia deploys its most advanced air and missile defense assets, additional Patriot PAC-3 batteries, THAAD coverage extensions, and the emerging integration of directed energy systems along the full length of the Petroline corridor and the MSC land route. It hardens Abqaiq beyond its current protection envelope. It coordinates with U.S. Central Command to establish a continuous aerial surveillance and rapid intercept posture over the Saudi interior that matches the naval deterrent presence in the strait. This path is technically achievable. It is also extraordinarily expensive, logistically complex, and requires a sustained U.S. defense commitment to Saudi Arabian infrastructure protection that Washington's current strategic priorities in the Pacific theater make increasingly difficult to guarantee. The second path is acceleration of underground and subsurface infrastructure redundancy, burying the MSC corridor's most critical logistics nodes, constructing hardened underground pump station replacements along the Petroline's most exposed sections, and developing true architectural redundancy rather than route redundancy. This path takes 5 to 7 years minimum to execute meaningfully. Iran's repositioned strike architecture is operational today. Neither path eliminates the vulnerability that Saudi Arabia's bypass ambition has created. Neither path returns the strategic picture to the clean, simple Hormuz choke point dynamic that both sides understood and had spent decades building deterrence frameworks around. Tactical assessment. Has Saudi Arabia's logistics revolution genuinely neutralized Iran, or has it simply relocated the battlefield to a more dangerous and less defended theater? Drop your analysis in the comments below. If this briefing gave you something the mainstream coverage completely missed, subscribe right now and turn on notifications. Tomorrow's briefing is already being compiled, and what Iranian proxy networks were detected doing inside Saudi Arabia's eastern province overnight is going to fundamentally change how you read this entire situation.